Nice to see you again on this beautiful Sunday. This time with a quote by Kevin Kelly, where he writes, "If you are out of ideas, go for a walk. A good walk empties the mind and then refills it with new stuff." And it resonates also with ancient wisdom, because how better to bust bullshit than to not find it in ancient wisdom represented. So Seneca writes, "The mind must be given relaxation. It will rise improved and sharper after a good break." So could you share how you connect to this experience, or some personal stories or insights or ideas?
Yeah, wonderful topic. And it points to something that we're all living with, which is that we are not a computer. We are a body mind. And a lot of times it's really natural for us to think and talk about our mental life, or at least typically deal with our mental life as if we are some kind of brain in a vat. And we are a brain in the vat of our skull, but our nervous system and the central nervous system that our brain is the largest part of actually does go throughout our body. And the energy of our mind is not created endogenously to the mind. There's these neurochemicals, of course, blah, 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 but our brain is a part of a much larger system that encapsulates far more than just 3 pounds of meat that's within our skull. It includes our full body. It includes our muscles. It includes the energy that we feel in our body. And the energy of our mind is directly impacted by the state of our body. Our emotions are felt primarily within our body, within our torso. And they, of course, impact the thoughts that come next, which then in turn impact our emotions that we feel within our body. And we can see that these cycles of thought, emotion, judgment are not cut off at the neck. They go all the way down. And so when we want to get a good relationship with our thoughts, when we want to have clarity of mind, when we want to have good judgment, when we want to have emotional balance and self-control, or wisdom of judgment or clarity, we cannot ignore the body. Otherwise, the mind is not going to work well. The body fuels the mind. And if we don't have good energy in the body, we won't have good energy in the mind. And when we don't have good energy in the mind really gets away from us. We can all kind of relate from experience. I definitely can say so myself. When I'm sleep deprived, when I go a while without exercising, when my habits deteriorate to the point where my body is lethargic and has poor energy or poor health, the mind becomes dull. The mind becomes less sharp. And when the mind is low energy, that's when we tend to get the most helplessly wrapped around the axle of our thoughts and narratives within our mind. So this concept of the body mind, and viewing this as one big system, viewing ourselves as one big system, is a very important foundation for us to recognize the important ways with which we can manipulate our habits or immediate actions in order to get better results from our brain and from our thinking. And this is especially important when we need to have self-control, when we're in difficult situations, when there's stress involved or overwhelm, and when clarity of judgment doesn't naturally flow off the tongue all the time, and it's important. When these are the case, then we should really look to get good results from our brain rather than mediocre results that are just good enough with where we're at. We should actually try to get good results. And to do so, we have to make the whole system work together. We have to let the body fuel the mind. We have to feel our body and be connected with the body. And then when we're in a position of flow, when we're in a position of good health and energy and well-being, we are in a far better space in which to make complex judgments, in which to process difficult stuff and multivariate stuff, to get into flow and to feel our best energy. And obviously there's a lot of ways to do that. I'm interested to hear how you think about the body mind and this embodied way of being, and perhaps the way that taking a walkabout can impact our mental state.
Yeah, thank you for the idea of the body mind connection, which is really important to state because we need to allow some time for rest and regeneration for our system to function smoothly. We cannot only see it as a machine which you engineer and then grease a little bit and then it runs forever. After you grease it a little bit again and then it runs even more. But we are an organism. Some parts of us are a machine, yeah, sure, but our organism lives and dies and decays and also grows. So if we are not growing or if we are not improving, we are decaying in a sense. So we have to choose where we want to put our focus on. And for challenging our growth and for challenging how we want to perceive the surroundings, we need to, after a challenge, regenerate again. After we trained our muscles, we need to rest again so the muscles can grow back and grow even stronger again, which reminds us about the term anti-fragility from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which is represented all around the world and in nature, especially if you look at the tree, for example, after a big storm, where the tree still survived the big winds, its roots grow just deeper into the ground because of the challenge the tree faced. And only if the tree has enough time and capacity to regenerate, then it can grow strong. So a walkabout can clear our mind as effectively as a good nap of 20 minutes or a non-sleep deep rest session where you breathe and try some mindfulness based stress reduction technique just to remove the stress out of the system so that it can glow and regenerate again, and that pathways which were challenged in neural pathways challenged by learning something new, which does not always feel really good if you learn something. It is like hard, it's challenging, and your mind goes, but after learning, after challenging yourself, what you need to manifest those pathways in your brain is regeneration, because only when you sleep well, then you manifested the learning inside your skull in a really sufficient and sustainable way. And regenerating with good sleep, for example, helps you to find a different base layer. Like, you perceive the world in a much different way if you perceive the world from a rested state versus from a state of high tension and high stress, where you tend to fall back into anxiety or agony. If you are overwhelmed by a situation, then you fall back to the most basic levels of your habitual thought patterns. And this is most of the time the amygdala responding fight or flight or freeze, or like our lizard brain reacting. And this is not what we want when we actually have the goal of self-actualization. We want to put in place some systems where we fall back to systems which help us to stay calm in the midst of a storm, to make better judgment calls and better decisions, and even in a storm, feel joy and peace, and even in a storm can relax. I'm wondering what you think about these thoughts.
Yeah, great thoughts. And really, you point to the benefits of leveraging our body and our physiological state, especially in moments of difficulty. And that's something that resonates a lot with my own personal experience, especially with, for my case, situations that come up totally unexpected with work and these sort of small crises or fires to put out that emerge on a daily basis, and this processing and the limitations of the processing within our mind, at least in our normal states. And as it relates to moments of emotional complexity, emotional difficulty, a lot of multivariate equations where, for example, you have an employee who's underperforming for a long time and then does something that's counterproductive or destructive, and you're reading into their intentions. You're trying to consider the amount of work that's been put in so far, the systems that rely on this individual, the path forward, what needs done, the precedent, the effect on the culture of the company, all of these. And of course, cost, benefit, alternatives. Can you find somebody else? What do you know? How do you know? How long would it take to train this person? How much effort can you spare that energy right now? What's the timing of this move? All these sort of things can hit you sort of all of a sudden with a couple of unexpected situations in entrepreneurship. And in fact, this kind of a calculus comes up probably once a month or at least once a quarter in my domain. And when it happens, I cannot rely on the logical narration side of the brain, the putting words in front of words, in front of words, in front of words in a linear sequence and hope that it will spit out a accurate calculation of the real world. The reality is that when we process stuff like this with the language brain, with the left brain, we're going to get some story, and this narrative is probably going to repeat itself. It's probably going to become diluted, and if we have emotions involved, it's definitely going to become diluted. The thoughts of our brain, this narrative, is going to trigger emotions within our body, and if we're not aware and we don't feel them, then these emotions in our body are then going to trigger different thoughts within our brain that are probably going to become far more distorted than the original set. And if we're locked in this egoic pattern, a way of processing and thinking, and we don't break out, we're very likely to, one, be in a state of total contraction and really not be happy and not enjoy where we're at. Two, we're going to have distorted thoughts that are going to lead to poor judgment and bad decision making. And three, it's going to probably trap us in this way of seeing with other situations that we encounter within the same day. And so it's counterproductive overall. But this is the natural thing to fall into a lot of times when situations in our life, and once again, not just in entrepreneurship, stuff happens like this in our personal life, with our relationships, with things going on with our living situation. It's not exclusive to entrepreneurs or leaders. But a better way of dealing with these situations, if we can manage it, is tapping into a deeper intelligence that is within us. An intelligence that can account for the context, an intelligence that can feel out all of the aspects involved with this situation and come to an intuitive clarity on the best way forward without a logical math algebra equation within our mind within words, which is oftentimes what we're attempting, and it's a futile effort because logical linear words are never going to take into account all of the context. We actually have to step back, let go of this narration within our mind if we do want clarity and intuition on these situations, and ultimately wisdom and clear judgment to make the right decisions when there's so many variables that we can't bring it all into an algebra equation within our mind. And this is more common than we often think, where this thinker brain, the language up in here, is not the right tool for the job. In fact, we need an intuition, an intelligence that accounts for the whole context, the big picture, that zooms out and that feels this situation. An intuition that is far more intelligent and multivariate and faster, instantaneous, less likely to trap and ensnare us than this logical thinker within the brain. And I find within my own experience that one of the best ways to trigger this greater intelligence is to cue up a change in physiological state and is to move my body. That can enable me to get sort of unstuck with this mindset and rigid framework of perspective that I often can have if I've been spending the last 30 minutes sitting still at a desk trying to quote unquote get to the bottom of it within my own mind. It's kind of a waste of time, and it can be actually counterproductive to our energy and clarity in a lot of the contexts where we really want the most clear judgment, and it's the most difficult to have clear judgment, and maybe the stakes are highest, and maybe our emotions are the most heightened about it. And so to get into a better intuitive way of making decisions and feeling stuff out, one that in the end is actually going to be much more productive and fruitful and accurate and clear, because our intuition can take into account the whole thing as opposed to just this very tunnel visioned, linear, quote unquote logical viewpoint and way of processing. then we can have a far greater intelligence to bring to bear over the situation, and far more reliable one. But the other side of it is, it does require a degree of faith, and a faith that, in my experience, is a product of watching how things play out when we try to logic through these things versus watching how things play out when we lean on the greater intelligence that doesn't get to the bottom of it, but actually just sees and feels and intuits what the right decision is within this context. This consciousness that we have within us is a far greater capacity than our limited ego thinker brain up here that we often lean on for these decisions. And when they're really complex, when they're really difficult, or when we're really getting our ass kicked and we're really emotional, we especially need to learn to take a step back and view this greater intelligence and to live from this place of more expansive, higher capacity being and judgment. And for me, a lot of times, going on a walk is one of the best ways I have found to begin to glimpse a more intuitive way of approaching the situation that I'm within. Going on a walk, or especially ideally a hike, but even just a 15-minute walk around my neighborhood, is a surprisingly powerful tool to involve my whole somatic machinery and the whole body mind to get into this wiser way of being. And once again, it is a deeper processing. And so, for example, if you're to kind of put it into a little more of a nature context, if you're a monkey and you see this dangling batch of bananas far off in the distance, and you see this terrain in front of you, you see a swamp over here to the right, you see a dense patch of briars over here to the left, you hear a sound in the far distance that is a very heavy sound, an animal that's making loud noises, possibly a predator. You see other things going for the bananas. You kind of have a view of the bananas and their size and their color, and you're trying to judge if they're ripe and ready for eating. You see how far down they're hanging, and you judge instantaneously, intuitively, whether or not you can reach them. You see this other shape that's kind of a little bit in the background of this batch of fruit that could be a predator, that could be something completely harmless, that might even just be a rock. You can't really tell because it's really far away. And you feel in your body how hungry you are. You feel how fast you are at running and how your body might be able to respond. And you have all of these different stimuli going on internally and externally. And you need to make a quick judgment about what you're going to do in this situation, how you're going to approach it. Are there alligators in this water in front of me where I really don't want to go through there? Am I going to get cut if I go through this patch of briars over here? Do I need to run from the sound that I just heard behind me? Are these bananas ripe and worth pursuing? Is it worth the risk? Can I climb up to them? Can I get them? Animals cannot, and we as humans even, cannot just do a logical bit of math in this, even if we're just talking about these 7 variables that I just threw out there and not the 300 other small variables that are entering into the equation. We can't do math and come to the right conclusion on this. And over the course of hundreds of millions of years, we've needed to make snap decisions, gut decisions, to be able to understand how to interact to these various stimuli that are right in front of us, to avoid predators, to go get food while we avoid predators, to reproduce and find these social opportunities that are right in front of us while we're balancing these other needs that we have and these other dangers and risks that we must avoid. This intuitive intelligence takes into account the entire context, all of our senses at once, and it can make these quick decisions with not a logical word simulation that we're creating in our brain about the future, but rather a gut feeling and emotion that takes into account all of these things in a processing that goes on many, 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 many layers at once. And this is actually what our system, what our body mind is really, really good at. Language and thinking and simulating about the future, this came a lot later. This is a lot of the new brain, the prefrontal cortex stuff. It's kind of the new stuff. We're good at talking. We're good at using language. We're with humans, and growing up in these small tribes, we got really, really good at talking to each other, and it became a big part of sexual selection within our species, and so it became super overpowered within us. And a lot of us think that this languagey prefrontal cortex part of our mind is actually the most intelligent, because it's what's different than what's within the animal kingdom, because it's what feels really special about us. It's because we have our identity all in this talker and all in this narrative and all in this and that. And it's really easy and normal and culturally normal and conditioned to live from this place of languaging and ego and left brain. And there's a lot of good to it. There's a lot of stuff that only can come from thought. I'm living in a house that obviously was not built by a chimpanzee, because they can't string together these future projections and come up with a precise plan about the future and understand with concepts and logic that can be manipulated and moved around and done math with. All this stuff is really important for certain things and long-term projects and manifesting for the future and blah, blah, blah. But in the other type of situation where we need to make a call, we don't have years to make the call. Perhaps it's an instantaneous decision. There's many things to take into account. There's body language that we're processing. There's people's tone of voice that we're processing. We're judging people's intuition or judging people's intention versus what they're presenting to us. We have a lot of variables that we need to take into account that we can't cleanly math out, because there's more than 3 variables. There might be 30 variables. There might be 60 variables. They might be internal and external. This multivariate processing is where we must lean on our intuition. We must lean on the greater capacity and intelligence that can take into account all of our senses, internal and external, a big amount of context, and can make these judgments instantaneously without twisting our brain up in 1,000 knots where we're completely incapacitated afterwards. And this is what our brains, this is what our body minds are actually really good at. These snap judgment intuitive decisions are the absolute price of survival and reproduction for every species in the world, and they have been for hundreds of millions of years. This is what our body minds got really, really, really good at for so much longer than we've had language, for so much longer than we've had logical processing, for so much longer than we've had simulations and projections about the past and the future and stories about them. It is the more intelligent part of our brain, and if we learn to harness it, it can empower us tremendously, and we can feel so much more free while we are leveraging this far greater capacity and power. If we ignore it, if we don't honor our intuition, if we don't honor our awareness, if we don't honor this greater capacity and intelligence within us, we are going to get so distorted, so twisted around in our mind, and we're going to get twisted up in knots, and we're not going to have a good time. And we're also going to make super diluted decisions, get wrapped up around the axle, do counterproductive shit, get addicted to various things, not have clear judgment, do things that we wish we could take back, live with a lot of regrets, be limited, be fearful about what other people are thinking about us, and be, to a large extent, constrained by this web of entangled language and thoughts within our mind if we don't recognize that it's only one of the toolkits that we have, and we have a greater, more intelligent, more instantaneous, and inherently free and harmonious toolkit within us that can make decisions quick and instantly, intuitively, that we can feel, but it's not going to give us a logical proof. It's not going to give us mathematics. It's not going to give us algebra. We're going to have to feel it, intuit it, and learn to trust it, watch what happens. And then when we watch what happens enough time, hopefully, that gives us enough experiential proof to lean on this more, to trust it more, to understand when we should bring this type of processing into our lives. And once again, going on walks, going on hikes, feeling and being within our body, even doing other things with our body, yoga, working out, playing sports, getting into these things that trigger flow states and really connect us with our somatic experience. These are super powerful tools if we want to learn to foster this greater toolkit, this greater intelligence and capacity that we all have within us, that the body, that our DNA has spent way longer fine-tuning than the toolkit that we typically lean on, and oftentimes are tempted to exclusively lean on due to the conditioning of our culture, due to the artificial environment that we find ourselves in. So this is a lot of what I view as the greatest fruit, the greatest potential of connecting to our body and our body mind as one great piece of, as one great organism, ultimately. And when we find out how to be in harmony with our nature and really leverage and trust this intuition, this gut feeling, this somatically felt knowledge within us, we can totally unlock ourselves, and we can be way more effective, and we can flow through the hard stuff that we're trying to do, including and especially the most emotionally complex, the most trepidatious, the most convoluted, the most mixed, the least clear decisions and judgment calls that we need to make in our life, especially if we want to full send stuff. So that's why I love going on walks in the middle of the day, especially when I'm going through some crazy shit during the week. What about you, man? What are your thoughts around this capacity? What are your thoughts around the ways that our body can empower us in some of these more difficult circumstances within our lives?
Hey, great points. And good connecting it to connecting ourselves back to our roots. Because ultimately we come from nature. We evolved with nature together. And there is some research which correlates the level of happiness or the absence of unhappiness with how many different bird sounds you can recognize and how many different bird sounds you can hear in your surroundings. And there we see, okay, if we can manage to reduce our load of stress we have in our body, we ultimately enter a state of more relaxation where we have bigger opportunity to access this intuition which you talked about, which is also the systems which help us intuitively make sense of the inputs surrounding us and making good judgment calls if we are connected to ourselves and to nature. And there's also a dichotomy in there because there's good research from Gerd Gigerenzer, it's a German probabilist, who also critiques a little bit the System 1 and System 2 approach from Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, where they state that maybe System 1 is the better tool. But System 1, which means I believe I mistake them because they don't have clear names, but the system which is which we need a high load in calculating stuff and so on. This is logical, but it takes much more time. A system which is more intuitively just makes instant judgment calls. So Gerd Gigerenzer points out that, for example, fire workers who have a gut feeling of, oh, we should go out, we should move out, people move out, because they have this kind of uneasiness in their gut. And this is the system which intuitively connects to the way of action which ensures better survival. And after 3 seconds after the firemen went out of the building collapsed. So this is one story where it absolutely makes sense to follow the judgment call of the system, which is intuitively. Only if you really have the experience, the build-up experience, moving yourself in this environment and learning much about this domain. So the system is at its best if you're really a domain expert, if you really live in this domain, and if you really enjoy thinking about it and so on. So then this is the most powerful tool we got. And connecting to nature, obviously, if we don't live in a concrete jungle, we have some domain expertise. And it is also proven that seeing some green leaves or whatever, surrounding yourself with greenery, reduces the level of cortisol in your blood, which correlates to the level of stress you feel, and also reduces the power of the amygdala over your judgments, over your perception, so that it's much less fear-ridden how you think, much less anxiety-driven how you act, and much less reactive, because ultimately we want to act and not just react. We want to take in everything that happens. We want to raise our negative capability, even if shit gets thrown at us. We don't want to overreact. We just want to move on, clean ourselves, and move on to the goal, because resisting is not as effective as building something up, as building yourself up, and so on. And that's also why I take a walk often throughout the week and midday in our break. I take some people of the team and say, come, we go forest bathing. It's in Japanese it's called Shinrin Yoku, which means diving into the atmosphere of the forest. This short 10-minute act alone gives us so much more clarity and better ability to make good judgment calls and see software bugs much better and solve them together. It also fosters communication and facilitates us working together. So taking a walk in nature changes your state, changes your brain, and changes your physique, changes the setup. Your whole organism is flooded by whichever elements or molecules flowing in the bloodstream, but the setup of these molecules improves when you reconnect to nature. You don't have to rethink your life if you feel unwell or uneasy. Sometimes just changing your physique, changing your state, moving your body, going into nature changes everything, changes your perspective on a problem, and therefore makes you better able to find solutions which are sustainable and not just a reaction which has second order consequences which you don't want. So I think we agree that if we are in a state of melancholy or whatever, taking a walk outside, looking into the clouds if it's cloudy, laying down in the sun, or rolling down a grassy hill, or just taking a walk in the woods resets our internal state, which helps us to think with much more clarity and make better judgment decisions so that it improves our lives ultimately. That's why I always feel I don't want to live in a concrete jungle. I want to live somewhere surrounded by nature, plants, and good people, So, what do you think?
Yeah, well, you've definitely pulled off the no concrete jungle. Looking at your background over Lake Lucerne, I will, I will say you're actualized in that domain. And a couple of closing thoughts on what you said is one, this way of being, this more intuitive, more clear, multivariate, instinctive way of being. What often gets in the way of that, for me, definitely, and I see it in many people, is the ego, is the way that our logical, thinky, languagey brain waves this web of thoughts and identity around our awareness. And it causes us to be rigid, it causes our ways of thinking to become rigid, causes us to see things in certain ways, and it gets us into ruts within our brain. And so for me, the first thing, if I am realizing that I've become disconnected from this greater intelligence and way of being, in addition to paying attention to my body and my energy, is also paying attention to my self-perception. Has my self-image become opaque to where the light of awareness can no longer shine through? Is the light being covered by a bushel? The bushel being the identity, the sense of self, the ego, the self-image. This is really common, and it's culturally conditioned. And it's something that, for some of us, like me, it's sort of a constant dance we must do where these temptations draw us back into a certain way of self-perception that can totally block us from the greater capacity that lies within us, that can become opaque and not allow this light to be able to shine and to be able to empower us on our path. And the other thing you pointed to that I think is just worth reiterating is this sprint and rest mentality. And a reason that I think it's forgotten, at least this is my hypothesis, is that the Industrial Revolution came along, whatever it was, 150 years ago in earnest, or 100 years ago in earnest. And it put a lot of our species in the Western world into completely unnatural environments that are not suitable for human beings. Being in a factory in a closed room, in a box, oftentimes with no windows, for 10 hours a day, standing still, doing repetitive tasks, is completely the opposite of being a Homo sapien in its natural environment, where we worked 20, 30 hours a week, we sprinted and rest, we had complete variety, we were doing different things every day, we were exploring our environment, we were mapping the territory, we were outside, and we were completely connected with our body and the way that our body navigated the world. We were embodied organisms. We are embodied organisms. And being in a factory environment is, once again, so unnatural, so opposite of this. It causes us to forget our nature and forget the way that we function best. We do not function best doing repetitive stuff in one spot for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, in a box with no windows. It's not good for us, and it's not how we grew up. And so we forget that the greatest performers of nature and the greatest performers of our species don't live like this. They don't work like this. We sprint and rest if we want to get peak performance. How does a lion work? Is he grazing all the time? Is a lion doing repetitive things? Is he grinding? Is he sitting in the same spot to practice and drill on what he does for 8 hours a day? No, of course not. Lions sprint. They go at absolute max speed, max performance, max strength. They go all out, and then they rest. They don't work 10-hour days in a row, and they don't stay in the same spot. And same with us. Same with the greatest creatives that have ever lived within our species. Same with some of the greatest builders, some of the greatest visionaries, some of the greatest artists, some of the greatest thinkers and physicists and scientists and mathematicians and writers and thinkers and philosophers and mystics, and all of them, they don't follow this linear volume, quantity over quality way of being in our work. And obviously we have constraints. We can't just totally go out and live like a flaneur all the time if we actually have to feed ourselves and make our way in the world for a while. We got to figure out how to bridge that gap for ourselves. But we should understand that the way that we tend to operate, the way that society and civilization has in some way created ruts in front of us that we fall into, is not conducive for peak performance and for maximum performance and for flourishing and for the greatest generative creativity that our body and mind are capable of. Lions sprint and rest. The greatest humans that we can point to in terms of creation also sprint and rest. And resting is something that is not just a matter of being idle and letting the brain do whatever it will. There's some intentionality that we can bring to rest. And I believe that allowing the dust of the mind to settle gives us a greater quality of rest that can enable greater sprints. And this quality versus quantity thing, like we've talked about in the past, is more and more and more important today as leverage and the means of leverage have become so incredibly powerful. Somebody that can create 50 paintings a week that are mediocre is not worth nearly as much as somebody who can create one world-class incredible painting per year, because that can be printed 100 million times and everybody only wants the best thing, or the absolute cream of the crop of something, because leverage has enabled various things to be reproduced, magnified, blown up, and utilized in far greater ways as opposed to high quantity, mediocre quality stuff. And this applies in business, this applies in, of course, creation of almost any type, and even in many of the ways that we try to improve ourselves or reflect and craft our mindsets and philosophies and values in our life. Quality means a lot more than quantity, and that phenomenon is growing in importance, not shrinking in importance every year as technology progresses. So sprinting and resting, quality over quantity, and embodying our way of being and tapping into the greater capacity and intelligence that's within us, which is the source, which is awareness. These are some of the best tools that we can bring to bear for an increasingly convoluted, complex, difficult, challenging, unfamiliar, and totally boundless environment that we find ourselves in the modern developed world in 2024. And so that's a lot of what I'm hoping to foster within myself so that I can be more effective. It's definitely not stuff that comes naturally to me. These are practices that I'm very much at the early stage of figuring out how to leverage and utilize and embody and integrate and all this stuff. I have so far to go, and it's so different than where I started in my nature and my conditioning. And so it's an exciting project to figure out how can I continue to leverage and lean on and trust and have faith in some of these principles of a more optimal way of being, of a more flowy way of being, of a more integrated, embodied, present way of being. And if I can figure it out, it's going to be pretty good. So I'm very much very glad that we discuss these things, because it's a useful reset and reframe to how I want to operate, my way of being, my approach, and my posture toward my work and my experience and my decisions. So any closing thoughts from you, my friend?
Thank you for your insights, man. And may we find and discover tools which help us to change our state, to be more relaxed and peaceful, to have better judgment calls, and ultimately making better decisions, which leads to a better life.
100%. Yep. Great talking to you, man. I really enjoyed this conversation. I look forward to the next one.
Looking forward to see you again, Peyton. See ya.
See ya.